Shots on goal, goals against average, and points per game can make or break your week. But don't overlook BPMM, Wendy's Bacon Portobello Mushroom Melt. Sure, it may not help you win weekly prizes with Wendy's and Daily Face-Off Survivor Pool Fantasy, but unlike your predictions, it never disappoints. So try your luck. Don't push it, because the Bacon Portobello Mushroom Melt is only back for a limited time. And if you miss it, you won't get a second chance. Sign up for Daily Face-Off Survivor Pool Fantasy today, sponsored by Wendy's and the Wendy's app. Now, we are going to be joined by a man who I am probably very likely going to owe a steak dinner to at some point down the road, Mr. Frank Seravalli. Frank, welcome. What's good, my man? How are you?
What was our bet again?
Steak dinner for the Canucks to play 500 hockey all the way through.
Oh God. Yeah, you might have already lost.
Well, the fact that you forgot it probably means that I probably
I may have forgotten, but that doesn't mean you can squelch on your bet.
This is true. I will not. So let's get into this, because I asked Harm right off the top. Through 41 games, they've got all these types of different records and shattering franchise numbers. What's impressed you the most about this team, or maybe even surprised you a little bit?
I think we all knew that the individual star talent was there with Quinn Hughes and Elias Pettersson and Thatcher Demko. I think, to me, it's more the cohesion of the rest of the team and the structure that they play with that has been way more impressive. Just because you get a new coach in there doesn't necessarily mean that you can snap your fingers and everything comes together. Look at the Ottawa Senators right now, and look, it's only been a short period of time since they fired DJ Smith, but Jacques Martin is having no success getting a group of freelancers essentially to play better. And that was kind of the stamp that existed on this Canucks team for the last couple years, was a sort of group that doesn't have its act together, maybe doesn't have the maturity to get its act together. And it takes, I think, a recognition on the part of the players to want to buy in. And it takes a coaching staff, and I say staff because it's not one person. I also think that the other assistants and frankly, the Sedins, from the skills perspective, they've assembled an all-star cast of coaching staff. And that's incredibly important, that they've all gotten everyone on board at the same time that the players have wanted to. So that, to me, is way more impressive than any record or number that people could set up.
Frank, how are other teams viewing the Vancouver Canucks right now? Because they just swept the New York teams. And I think out east, you're starting to pick up more momentum around this idea that, are the Canucks a legitimate Stanley Cup contender? Do you think other executives and teams are at that point now where they're starting to view the Canucks as a legit Cup contender?
Yeah, I mean, look, I don't have them in that category yet. But I just taped a podcast this morning for next week with Colorado Avalanche GM Chris McFarland, and we were talking about the state of the Western Conference, in that it's a meat grinder. Like, you're talking about 7 authentic teams that have a chance to come through and represent the West in the Cup final. I wouldn't be surprised if any of those teams, and I'm including Edmonton in that group as a wild card, which they could grab one of those top 3 spots in the Pacific, crazily enough. I think the Canucks have been great. I've been, one of these people, not to pat myself on the back, kind of at the forefront of saying this team's really good, but I still think they're a piece or two away from really being in that inner circle of 5 to 6, 7 teams that can win it all. And some people might say that part of the reason for that isn't even necessarily who they go out and acquire. Part of it is that they haven't gone through the battles, the trials and tribulations of being down in a series, being on the ropes, having your season on the line, the pressure of, really putting it all together when it matters most. That I do think there's an element of learning how to win that matters. And some would say you need to, look at the Chicago Blackhawks in 2009 and their run to the West Final that was maybe a little bit ahead of schedule. 2010, they come back and win the Cup. I probably tend to agree with that line of thinking. I don't think it's impossible, but I do think that there's still a couple holes with this team that I think they need to go out and fill.
What are the holes? I mean, look, I agree with you in your statement saying that I don't really have them as a contender yet, but I think that teams are looking at them, to Harm's point, a lot differently than they did before the season or even right around American Thanksgiving. So,
They should.
yeah, if you're the, Patrick Alvin and Jim Rutherford, where do you assess your biggest holes that you probably need to fill?
I think they're probably, some of the injuries that they've had this year have highlighted this. I think they're one more true defender away. And then I think up front, you're probably looking at a piece, somewhere in your forward group that can be a little bit more, I don't know if versatile is the right word, but more of an elevator player in that, if you need, can play in the top six, and if not, has a really clear defined role in the bottom six. Cause that's kind of one thing that they went out and found a bunch of those, pieces to help different facets of the game, whether it's penalty kill or face offs or whatever it might be. They did a great job last summer of figuring out some of those needs. But to me, I think, someone that when they're not doing the top thing, like look at, here's a great example is Kuzmenko. Like everyone knows the talent that he has. He has 1 goal away last year from 40 goals and 75 points as a rookie. His offensive ability is unquestioned, but when he's not scoring, and since he's kind of continually been violating the quote unquote non-negotiables from Rick Tocchet, what is he doing for you? How can he help you? And that's the one thing that, if you're not scoring, get me someone at the trade deadline that you can point to and say, I know exactly what that guy's doing to help this team win.
Yeah, no, and I think that that's one of the things that Rick Tocchet, you mentioned the non-negotiables. I think that is beat into a lot of these players' minds day in and day out in meetings and things like that. Frank, I got to ask you, with William Nylander signing his big contract extension, a lot of eyes now turning towards obviously Elias Pettersson and what's going on here. We've heard a number of different things. From what do you know and people that you've talked to, what's the latest regarding the Canucks forward?
I think the Canucks are pushing hard to get something done and get an answer. I think they'd love to have this locked up, even a month out from the trade deadline. That was the big push from the Leafs, was we'd love to go out and, for instance, potentially get a defenseman with term using some of that John Klingberg money that we have on LTIR, or maybe, even if we have some extra cash lying around from Ilya Samsonov, depending on what they decide to do. But we can't really go out and do that until we know what Nylander is locked in at next year and beyond. From a pure, pecking order perspective, Pettersson is obviously at the very top of that list. And I think the Canucks are kind of antsy to say, we need to get this done. The problem is the exact opposite on the other end of it, that it's like, they're the other side. The Pettersson camp is they're saying all the right things, behind the scenes. It's been very cordial, but it's like trying to nail down water. Like you can't do it if the other side's not ready to come to the table and talk yet. And so I think that part has maybe been a source of frustration for the Canucks if you were to inject some truth serum into them. I think the other part is there was maybe a waiting period, not just because Pettersson's in no rush, but because you want to see how that market develops. How do they approach contracts with the salary cap rising for the first time in 4 years? And the Nylander deal really helps set the table, set the market to, hey, you now know what another, a scoring winger does in this league at a high end, 100+ point pace. Where does Pettersson slot in as a game-changing center that I think really when you size these two guys up, it's hard to do. But ceiling-wise, I think Nylander is he's at it right now. Like he's never going to be any better than he is at this exact moment in time, which is he's 5th in league scoring. He doesn't need to be that much more. Yeah. I still watch Pettersson and I'm going, man, I think this guy's kind of still just scratching the surface. And that is the tantalizing part, but probably in terms of getting a deal done, a frustrating part.
Frank, looking around the league a little bit, there's been some buzz around Trevor Zegras' name, especially maybe in light of Ducks being able to go out and get another marquee forward in Cutter Gauthier. What do you make of Zegras' potential future in Anaheim? Is he a player that the Ducks could be open to listening to offers on.
Yes, and he was added to the trade board, the trade targets board on dailyfaceoff.com yesterday, and promptly went out and got injured. So that was a little bit frustrating in terms of the conversation and how that evolves. But on a macro level, I think the real truth is that people who understand the Ducks line of thinking is Pat Verbeek doesn't seem to be a believer in the style that Trevor Zegras plays. Some would call it one-dimensional, that he doesn't think that meshes with his vision of how a team should play. And when you have a player that's that creative, back-to-back 60-point seasons, still really quite young, that goes through this sort of rough contract negotiation that he did, missing the bulk of training camp with the Ducks, it kind of leaves a sour taste in everyone's mouth. And so then you throw on top of it one of his best friends in Jamie Drysdale, who also had a really tough negotiation. He ends up going to Philly, and you kind of look and you say, is there writing on the wall here for him to be the next guy out of town, given that they have Gauthier and given that Leo Carlsson is sort of their ideal, superstar in the making. And he's been really special this year. And then Mason McTavish, like, they've got all these pieces that if you have a square peg in a round hole, that maybe you capitalize on some of the value that exists there. Like, I don't think anything's imminent, but I'm told, and sources say that, when Pat Verbeek has spoken with other teams, he's dangled the idea of, hey, Trevor Zegras might be a guy that, we'd be willing to part with. And so that's something that has really kind of captured the attention of teams as well.
Is it because Zegras doesn't really fit that style? I mean, I know Verbeek's trying to do something different there in Anaheim and the coach that they have down there as well, but is it the style of play or I don't want to say the personality, because you want to have so much personality in today's NHL and we love what Zegras does, but is that kind of why maybe he finds himself the odd man out a little bit?
I don't think so. I mean, look, in every different dressing room, there's all sorts of different personalities and quirks and different things that, happen or are perceived to happen. I think he's kind of, respected as someone who keeps things light and fresh, someone who is sort of the quintessential new age, next generation of NHL players that, for whatever reason, it's not personality. I think it's more game that rubs the Ducks the wrong way, that, they see how good he can be. And they also then, instead of harnessing all the things that make him excellent, tend to focus too much on all the other things that he doesn't do, the play in his own end, the back checking, attention to detail, things like that, that you see someone like Kuzmenko, who reached a level already in the NHL that Zegras has not, even though, yes, he's a bit older, but are driving the Canucks crazy this year. That's sort of what the Ducks are experiencing and have experienced with Zegras.
Frank, thank you so much for your time. We will pay tons of attention, obviously, to your trade bait board on Daily Faceoff. Thanks again for joining us.
Yeah, Irf, I'm just writing down here, steak dinner sometime in May. So
where?
See you then. The most expensive place I can find.
All right. Well, I'm in.
All that sweet, sweet Canucks conversation money.
Thanks, Frank.
See you guys.
Enjoy the day, buddy. That was Frank Seravalli, Harm. Lots to get into with Frank. I think the Zegras conversation is an interesting one because you mentioned, he obviously said that, the personality is not an issue, but I think that this style of him, maybe it's something a little bit different than what Pat Verbeek is trying to do over there.
Yeah, and I'll say this, over the years, and we're going to do it again, where The Athletic does an anonymous player poll. And one of the questions is, who's the most overrated player in the league? Who's the most underrated player in the league? And keep in mind, we're asking, I'm asking these questions, and reporters around the NHL are as well. Especially, point being, I'm not just asking Canucks players, visiting teams come in, I'm asking them as well. And Zegras tends to be a name that pops up among overrated players, because I think they perceive him as, yeah, he can score the highlight reel goals. He has a lot of flashy skill, but they look at him as, I don't think he's a guy you can win with, whether it's true or not. And I'll say this, I watched a lot of Zegras recently because I was watching Drysdale in the aftermath of that trade. And I think there's a ton of potential there. And I think if you put him in the right environment with an accountable coaching staff, the right veteran leadership core, I'm a big fan of the player. And I think we've seen examples of players like Tyler Seguin when Boston sort of traded him away. And Zegras is still so young that I think he can figure it out. But right now, I do think that perception exists, not just within Anaheim, but among some of his peers that, yeah, okay, he does a lot of flashy things offensively, but how much of that actually translates to winning and success and being more than just a one-dimensional producer.
Canucks Conversation with Harman and Quads every weekday at 2 p.m. Be sure to check it out on the Canucks Army YouTube channel. And if you missed it, go check it out on your favorite podcast catcher app.